The information contained in this podcast is an expression of opinion and does not constitute investment advice. This is the Gold Money Podcast with Alistair MacLeod, keeping you up to date with expert opinion on precious metals and the markets.
Hello, this is Alistair MacLeod on behalf of Gold Money, and with me on the telephone from London is Ben Davies, who is the co-founder and CEO of Hind Capital, and Hind Capital run the Gold Fund. Welcome to this podcast, Ben.
Thanks very much, Alistair. It's a pleasure to be on.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. I see that on your website, which is hindcapital.com, I think, isn't it?
That's right.
You've posted a very interesting document which you title "The Central Bank Revolution 1." Now, I think this is particularly apposite because there is talk about nominal GDP targeting, and your document really goes into this in some detail. Can you very, very briefly tell our listeners what this NGDP targeting and level targeting is all about, and why it's something that is relevant to today?
Well, it's quite a long document. I think it was a little bit of academic edification for ourselves. I think the central bank revolution is called "Well, Nominally So," a little play on this concept of nominal GDP level targeting. And what that means is that central banks determine a path along which nominal GDP would grow, and rather like an inflation target, except the difference is at the moment, central banks indulge in this flexible inflation targeting, which is where dual mandates lead to a policy incoherence, excuse me, which ultimately leads to a situation, do the central bank, do they target inflation or unemployment? And often they have to target both of them and take them in different directions, and so ultimately don't achieve their objective. So there's been this new strain of economic thought that's actually come through the blogosphere, and it's called market monetarism, and it's about targeting this nominal GDP. And nominal GDP is essentially your real GDP, which is the quantity of goods sold in the economy, effectively multiplied by a price component. So that's your nominal variable. So you can think of real GDP, if it's running at 4% and inflation's running at 4%, you have a nominal GDP of 8%. So the belief is by market monetarists and people who are proponents of NGDP-LT targeting is that we actually had this market disorder in 2008, this nominal shock that hit nominal GDP, and actually the Federal Reserve in this case, or other central banks as well, they didn't actually cut rates enough. Now, in our piece, we've really tried to dissect intellectually in an honest way, although I have to confess I'm somewhat biased because I don't believe in a central bank in the first place. I believe in free banking, adhered to some form of backing to a hard asset. So perhaps it's hard for me to not have a bias when I'm sort of looking at something that involves targeting within a central bank. But suffice to say, their thought process is that in order to get back onto trend path nominal GDP, you have to undershoot or overshoot over a period of time. Now, the problem with this is where do you start from? And we can debate on from there.
Yeah, I mean, so, yes. I think on page 13, you quoted Lars Christensen, who was one of the sort of the leading guys in this market monetarism. And I thought this quote was actually quite indicative of the thinking process behind it all. And he wrote, the view of the leading market monetarists is that the Great Recession was not caused by a banking crisis, but rather by excessively tight monetary policy. Now, I have a problem with that because it is quite clear to me, and I think it is knowing how you think economically as well, I think it's pretty clear to you, that the banking crisis was actually caused by the expansion of credit in previous years. And so the idea that, the banking crisis caused the Great Recession is actually wrong. It was actually the expansion of credit before. So, the supposition behind the whole thing is wrong to start with. And so now they're talking about an excessive, it was caused rather by an excessively tight monetary policy. Well, if you ease interest rates suddenly from, 6-7% down to zero, how is that excessively tight? The problem, I would have thought, is more that there is suddenly a very, very sharp shift for very good reasons in the preference for money. And I can't quite see how trying to deal with, trying to stop, the recession or the depression or whatever by monetary means actually can work, let alone coming up with a newfangled device called NGDPLT. Am I have I got this somehow wrong, do you think, Ben?
Well, we're singing from the same hymn sheet. There's no doubt about it. There is a section here where we put money matters, but credit matters more. And there is no doubt that the excessive credit proliferation that we saw over this entire fiat currency regime that started back in 1968 and that period where Nixon effectively shut the gold window. In fact, it was actually Lyndon Johnson who removed one of the constraints, and I would argue there were sort of two or three reasons why credit got excessive, and as a reality, money is less important in sort of determining sort of variables in the economy today, and which is why actually to some extent it's outside the control of the central bank. But it was actually Lyndon Johnson. Under the Gold Elimination Act, he actually removed the backing of currency at the federal deposits, which originally used to be at 40% under the 1930 Federal Reserve Act. So that was removed. He then, over that same period, I think it was around 1947, liquidity provisions were reduced in terms of the banks only had to have, historically used to have, quite an inordinate amount of capital made available in case depositors wanted their money back. Now that got lower and lower and lower, and we saw funding starting to come from different areas of the economy. It came from the euro paper market. It came from euro deposits market. You got the commercial paper market. Financial regulation change, which allowed financial institutions or non-bank institutions to issue and also borrow credit. This led to the issuance of what we all now know as CDOs and CLOs, RMBS, is that whole abracadabra of credit. And
this was shadow banking on top of declared banking, in effect.
Yeah, absolutely. So the removal of those two constraints, the first, the gold removal and the liquidity provision reduction, meant that inside banking, what we call the multiplier from lending, was able to get larger and larger, because obviously if you have to keep less money behind, you can lend out more. So that was one component. The second component was clearly this change in financial regulation, or deregulation, if you like. We had a revocation of the Glass-Steagall Act. Investment banks and commercial banks came back together. This really sort of set the trend for this whole credit wave. So I think that where historically under Fisher's equation of exchange, the classic MV equals PT, where historically you could alter money as a variable in the system, and what the monetarists would love is that essentially you contract the money supply and real GDP would come off for a period of time and prices would come down. And obviously conversely, if money was expanding in the economy, you would start to see real output in the short term go up, but prices remaining higher in the longer term. So the classic monetarist argument.
Yeah, that's so long as the trick isn't sussed by the workers who are being defrauded of their wages and the savers who are being defrauded of their money.
Well, I think that's an interesting point, because I think what happened when you have the credit expansion that we saw, ironically, that sort of insidious inflation that you'd normally have seen through sort of CPI's PCE components wasn't there. And we can talk about that in a minute in terms of sort of labor effects from globalization. But also credit did create that longer term real effect of wealth that was coming through housing, for instance. People were able to borrow money. They used a house like an ATM. Now, of course, there are large swathes of the economy that aren't owner occupiers. They're renting. But to some extent, there was a real spin-off wealth effect from this right across the economy. So I think until the point where asset prices were too high and you really couldn't service your debt levels in order to pay for such higher assets, and effectively industrial output was just exceeded what the market could take in terms of corporates and individuals' own income. Just couldn't afford to pay for it. That's when credit contraction actually ended, and that's when we all realized, hang on a minute, this has been an illusion of wealth, and which is why now today, coming back to where the market monetarists and the central banks, and there's one section called the Central Bank Manifesto, Checklist Manifesto, they've been looking at the wrong components. In the same way that market monetarists, they've just completely overlooked that credit has really been the driver of real GDP within the economy. And so by trying to target the monetary component, I get M and V up in order to get price levels up and ultimately real GDP levels up, we all know that actually real variables, i.e. real output, won't go up that much and prices will go up. And the reason why that it is because there's still a massive overhang of credit. And probably the last component of that is you've got to think about debt and credit are two flip sides of the same debased coin. So for an individual, so one man's debt is another man's asset.
Yeah.
And this is a really important point, because if you understand that concept, you then begin to understand that fractional reserve banking, effectively a lot of assets on the balance sheet are someone else's credit or debt, which makes you realize that they have spurious value, because obviously there's been layers of credit upon layers of credit. So you have what Minsky talked about as this speculative financing. It's effectively a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah.
And zero interest rates have circumvented the reassessment of what this collateral or what these assets are truly worth. And we haven't cleared that system to any extent.
Yeah, well, on the subject of collateral, I mean, there's just so many distortions around. I look at the Basel II and III regulations, and the preference given to the system to sovereign debt, it seems to me, is actually somewhat bizarre, when quite a lot of the sovereign debt should have a larger haircut than a lot of corporate debt. But a lot.
Well, if I can interject,
yeah.
I mean, you bring up a great point, and you know this, I know. This is about financial repression. I mean, these are historical economists, and they are some modern-day economists, Rogoff and Reinhardt, have written extensively about financial repression, and they have probably got the best papers on it, certainly. And financial repression, and I think it was McKinnon was the original individual who first started talking about it. But of course, central banks and governments, depending on your point of view, if there's fiscal dominance, i.e. the government's controlling the situation, or the central banks more through sort of monetary policy and monetization. But either way, there's a symbiotic relationship there, and it's absolutely incumbent on them to have these banks hold their sovereign debt.
Yeah,
this is how fractional reserve banking works. You have a zero provision, obviously, against your capital weightings, your tier one for government debt. So it's allowed to be lent out multiple times, and that's fantastic. And as you say, it's been now degraded, but they can't afford for that. This is the rules to be rewritten in terms of sovereign debt, because otherwise, who's left to buy it? I mean, if you look at someone like Japan, the biggest banks there, 70% of their asset base is in, guess what, JGBs.
Absolutely, yes.
So
no, I think that
they're forcing domestic institutions to buy their government debt. In effect.
Absolutely, and the system is sort of set up to do that. But getting back to this nominal GDP targeting, when I look at what has happened in terms of money going into the banks and the banks expanding credit, the application of that expansion of credit, it seems to me, has not been into the economy, but it has been out of the economy into capital speculation. Now, how are the central banks going to change that merely by changing the metric that they're targeting from, whether it's real GDP or nominal GDP? I mean, they've still got the problem. They don't seem to have a means. They don't seem to know how to get the money they create into the economy. I'm not saying that this is a good objective. What I'm saying is that is the central bank's objective, and they seem to be they've failed under all conditions to do that. I can't see how they're going to succeed in steering the economy by merely changing the metric that they're targeting.
I mean, I think this is the great debate, isn't it? Their argument is it's almost reframing the argument. There's this politics of inflation whereby if a central bank is expected to overrun its inflation target, then people think, oh, our purchasing power is going to go down, which is obviously the case because that's what happens. Their argument obviously is that under a productivity cycle that perhaps you shouldn't be raising rates in response to you shouldn't be cutting rates in response to lower inflation. And similarly, there's a nominal shock from an oil shock, for instance, and also inflation is higher, you shouldn't be raising rates. And again, I think the thought process here is misguided because it comes back to you've misunderstood what's driven the economy in the first place. Now, the reason why, if you try and target a nominal GDP, irrespective of whether you say your income is going up, I reframe it, the inflation concept, and say, look, our forward guidance is going to be that we're just going to allow we're going to increase the money supply and we're going to allow inflation to go up, and we want to encourage you to spend. But actually, this is going to help your income rise because producers they're going to raise their margins and your real wages will go up and you'll have more money to spend. I think, for instance, Ben Bernanke, I mean, he's a real proponent of this. He's talked about this concept of portfolio channel theory, which is if you drive long end interest rates down, ultimately you will force agents in the economy or speculators and investors to start shifting into risk assets such as equities. And if you get equity indices up, there's the belief that there'll be a boon, a wealth effect, which will again spin back for corporates. Corporates have more money in theory, and obviously consumers will spend more. And that will start to then produce revenue, tax revenues that pay down, obviously, the overburdensome debt that we have. Yeah. Now, that's what they're trying to do. And in some ways, so that fits with what you're saying about actually all that's happened is we've seen this channel effect and asset prices are going up, and we're not seeing any inflation actually arise in core goods and prices. And we can talk about that in a minute.
Yeah.
So he's affected it, but I think it's completely the wrong reason. And the reason why it's not going to derive in sustainable long-term growth is because the debt levels are just too large. So all we're going to get is stagflation. We're going to have this overhang of debt. Growth is, again, turning over. And we had a lot of liquidity indicators that said in this quarter we would have this little fillip of monetary surgence into the economy and that we would get industrial output start to pick up. You know what? It's already beginning to turn over. And that's frightening to my... Yeah. So all we're seeing is the same excesses of risk-taking that we've seen before.
Yeah,
absolutely, I agree with you.
It's very worrying. I mean, the more we discuss this, the more you're convincing me that the central bankers actually have got no understanding of what they're doing, and they have got even less control over things. I'm not surprised they have got very little control. They just rely, if you like, on trying to bull up our confidence, and that is hardly a long-term plan. Talking about central bankers, we've got Mark Carney coming in the middle of this year, and he seems to be sort of, well, not against it, but perhaps in favour of this market monetarism. What's your take on his views?
I mean, certainly the marketplace has embraced Carney as being someone that is open to a higher bound for inflation. I mean, I would argue to some extent that for a long time, Mervyn King, he used his phrase, it's the level stupid. And he in many ways, he was kind of allowing nominal GDP to rise by being above target on the inflation anyway. So
yes.
I think that he's been quite mischievous. In hindsight, when I first heard him start talking about this back in, I think it was was it in December or maybe even before that?
Yeah.
But I think he ultimately did a communique, didn't he, at Davos, and he started talking about this concept of the problem of the dual mandate, and should we look at other means of targeting monetary policy? Should we make it more rule-based? And although it's interesting because he actually acknowledges that you can't let bygones be bygones, you have to have a historical reference, which comes back to people who want to use NGDP level targeting, nominal GDP level targeting. They have to have a start date. So my criticism would be, where do you start from? What is considered where do you extrapolate a trend path from? So, for instance, there's a lady called Christina Romer. She's an economist in the States, and she's another proponent of market monetarism. She advocated starting NGDP trend pathway from 2007, the absolute height of the bubble.
Yes.
So on that basis, we have to create so much more money in the system in order to get the price level up to obviously get the nominal GDP component back up above that trend pathway, which is astronomical. And guess what? Based on this credit system, that was the bubble period, in my opinion. We actually we extrapolated based on 1994 start date in the US, which was coincidentally that's when the FOMC. They moved from signaling through open market operations what the interest rate was to actually tacitly saying, at a date, this is what the new interest rate is going to be. And when you look at that, that's quite revealing because that came up with a 4.5% trend pathway for NGDP. And guess what? We're back on that trend pathway. And the period from 2001 to 2007 was the exuberant period, which tends to certainly subjectively fit in with what we all know. Yeah. So going back to Carney, I think he's been quite mischievous because he started off by suggesting that he was going to do that he would look at NGDP targeting, and I think I think because he's just come into quite an austere institution as a Bank of England, he's not going to just radically change things overnight. I don't think he can do that. It's going to be much more subtle. But I think what he was angling for was to say, well, I'm suggesting we could do this, but I won't do it for the time being. But in the interim, all the things that we have been doing, the FLS and quantitative easing and qualitative easing, will continue to do that, which, if you think about it, 4 or 5 years ago, we would have thought was absolutely radical and extreme.
Well, absolutely, yeah.
And now it's, well, that will be considered norm. So it allows him to keep pursuing, that policy, which they need to, because let's face it, the UK growth is moribund, and there are no tax revenues. And the only reason really QE is being undertaken is not to rekindle the monetary transmission and get spending going. That would be a lovely benefit if it could happen for governments. It's purely to meet the fiscal coffers, that fiscal gap.
Absolutely. I've always maintained that there are two objectives for QE. One is to stop the banks falling over, and the other is to fund governments. It's as simple as that.
Absolutely. I mean, it is no more complex than that, and I think economists try to wrap it up in arcane concepts, and I really think keep it simple, stupid. That's what's going
absolutely.
on.
Which makes me instantly suspicious that this nominal GDP targeting is a means by which they can print yet more money and get away with it. Or am I being ultra cynical?
Well, I mean, that's what I wanted to avoid, making that conclusion straight away. Clearly, this is the huge debate, isn't it? That really, by using this new methodology, the other component of it is is forward guidance. They're going to tell economic agents that we are going to keep monetary conditions ultra loose until such time as we hit this trend pathway, this trend growth of what I call it 5% nominal GDP, which means, by the way, you'd have to go to 7 for a period of time in order to meet that target.
Which is frightening.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's frightening because, as classic monetarists will agree, the real output will largely not move very much, and just the price component will go up. And as I repeat again, and I apologise, because of the credit overhang, that is absolutely what will happen.
Yeah.
So yes, it may be cynical. It's just, I think it's a reality. I mean, it's interesting. The guy who's probably talked most about this is the chap Sumner. And this is a preeminent economist. There's no doubt about it. He did work for the Fed many years ago. He interestingly, he kind of undid himself a little bit. Yeah, he said that, I'm just sort of trying to think of quite the phrase, but he actually said that something along the lines of that if a poor country could develop its economy by simply printing money, so someone like Zimbabwe
would be rich,
would be effectively the wealthiest country in the world. So he kind of, on one level he's pushing for this, and then on a level he recognises that
there's a flaw in the argument. Yes,
there's a flaw in the argument. So I was left a bit confused by him, and I so wanted to just sort of have my neutral head on it and examine it. And actually, when I first read it, I thought, wow, this is actually quite compelling. And then you start getting into the minutiae and you realise that it was quite easy to pick flaws in some of their concepts. I think sometimes it's quite easy to pick flaws in prose. I'll certainly say that. But I certainly came away going, at the end of the day, until such time as the reserve bank obligations, or the bank reserves that have been created, which are unbacked by any hard asset or any kind of capital of any note, even though, of course, we see them increasing capital adequacy ratios. The only reason they're doing that is because they want the banks to buy, guess what, all sovereign debt, because they need a buyer other than the central bank to do it. So, until such time as we re-rate an asset like gold and back it to all this reserve accumulation, then I really see no, I'm trying to think of a polite way. If I think the way to describe it, if you back gold to the system, it's probably the least disruptive method in terms of social unrest. Because I think actually most people won't be affected in a negative way if you do that.
Subscribe to the Gold Money newsletter at www.goldmoney.com to receive email updates on new articles, videos, and iTunes podcasts from our Gold Research section.
GDP level targeting. And what that means is that central banks determine a path along which nominal GDP would grow, and rather like an inflation target, except the difference is at the moment, central banks indulge in this flexible inflation targeting, which is where dual mandates lead to a policy incoherence, excuse me, which ultimately leads to a situation, what do the central bank, do they target inflation or unemployment? And often they have to target both of them and take them in different directions, and so ultimately don't achieve their objective. So there's been this new strain of economic thought that's actually come through the blogosphere, and it's called market monetarism, and it's about targeting this nominal GDP. And nominal GDP is essentially your real GDP, which is the quantity of goods sold in the economy, effectively multiplied by a price component. So that's your nominal variable. So you can think of real GDP, if it's running at 4% and inflation's running at 4%, you have a nominal GDP of 8%. So the belief is by market monetarists and people who are proponents of NGDP-LT targeting is that we actually had this market disorder in 2008, this nominal shock that hit nominal GDP. And actually, the Federal Reserve in this case, or other central banks as well, they didn't actually cut rates enough. Now, in our piece, we've really tried to dissect intellectually in an honest way, although I have to confess I'm somewhat biased because I don't believe in a central bank in the first place. I believe in free banking, adhered to some form of backing to a hard asset. So perhaps it's hard for me to not have a bias when I'm sort of looking at something that involves targeting within a central bank. But suffice to say, their thought process is that in order to get back onto trend path nominal GDP, you have to undershoot or overshoot over a period of time. Now, the problem with this is, where do you start from? And we can debate on from there.
Yeah, I mean, so yes, I think on page 13 you quoted Lars Christensen, who was one of the sort of the leading guys in this market monetarism, and I thought this quote was actually quite indicative of the thinking process behind it all. And he wrote, the view of the leading market monetarists is that the Great Recession was not caused by a banking crisis, but rather by excessively tight monetary policy. Now, I have a problem with that because it is quite clear to me.
The information contained in this podcast is an expression of opinion and does not constitute investment advice. This is the Gold Money Podcast with Alistair MacLeod, keeping you up to date with expert opinion on precious metals and the markets.
Hello, this is Alistair MacLeod on behalf of Gold Money, and with me on the telephone from London is Ben Davies, who is the co-founder and CEO of Hind Capital, and Hind Capital run the Gold Fund. Welcome to this podcast, Ben.
Thanks very much, Alistair. It's a pleasure to be on.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. I see that on your website, which is hindcapital.com, I think, isn't it?
That's right.
You've posted a very interesting document which you title "The Central Bank Revolution 1." Now, I think this is particularly apposite because there is talk about nominal GDP targeting, and your document really goes into this in some detail. Can you very, very briefly tell our listeners what this NGDP targeting and level targeting is all about, and why it's something that is relevant to today?
Well, it's quite a long document. I think it was a little bit of academic edification for ourselves. I think the central bank revolution is called, well, nominally so, a little play on this concept of nominal GDP.